Everett Shaw arrived at Kingsley Field carrying nothing but a maintenance folder and a cold lunch packed in a dented metal box, not to fly the silver $80 million jet waiting on the runway, but simply to sign a routine inspection sheet before the sun climbed higher over the tarmac. He had no assistant trailing behind him, no gleaming watch catching the light, no entourage whispering into earpieces the way the visiting investors did as they strolled past the hangar in tailored coats. His flight jacket was faded at the collar, patched at one elbow, the kind of garment a man keeps because it still fits rather than because it still impresses anyone. Around him, the airfield buzzed with a nervous, electric excitement, because today Kingsley Aeronautics would unveil the Sovereign jet to a room full of international financiers who controlled contracts worth more money than most small nations. Everett moved through that excitement like a man who had already learned, the hard way, what excitement could cost a person who trusted it blindly. When Chief Executive Vivian Kingsley saw his name flash unexpectedly onto the backup pilot roster, the mood in the operations room shifted instantly from triumphant to tense. Kingsley Field had been transformed overnight into something closer to a stage than an airfield, with red carpeting rolled toward the private terminal and a row of gleaming vehicles parked for the arriving delegation of international financiers. Banners bearing the Sovereign name hung along the hangar walls, and technicians in matching uniforms moved with the choreographed precision of people who understood exactly how much money rode on the next few hours. Everett walked past all of it without slowing his pace, offering a polite nod to a fueling crew he recognized and otherwise keeping his attention on the folder tucked under his arm. A few younger staff members whispered as he passed, repeating rumors that he had once been a pilot before some unspecified breakdown following his wife's death left him unfit for real responsibility, and others claimed he now worked only odd shifts in the maintenance hangar because nobody trusted him with anything more. Everett heard fragments of it, as he always did, and said nothing, because defending himself to strangers had stopped feeling worthwhile years ago. He finished signing off on a routine secondary systems check, glanced at his watch to calculate whether he could still make his evening call with his daughter, and turned to leave the operations building entirely. If you enjoy stories where quiet people expose the truth that powerful rooms try to bury, press subscribe now so you never miss the next reversal that leaves everyone speechless. Vivian Kingsley entered the operations room the way she entered every room that mattered, in a white tailored suit, flanked by Chief Operating Officer Dashiell Crane and Board Chairman Harlan Prescott, trailed by a cluster of communications advisors murmuring numbers into their tablets. This launch would decide whether Kingsley Aeronautics secured a contract that could reshape the company for a decade, and Vivian had no patience left for surprises of any kind. When she heard Everett's name attached to the backup roster, her jaw tightened, and Dashiell leaned close to remind her that Everett Shaw was the man who had once delayed the entire Sovereign program for 6 months over what Dashiell called an obsession with imaginary safety flaws. Harlan added his own irritation, insisting that investors could never be allowed to see a grounded pilot anywhere near the cockpit of their flagship jet. Everett was summoned into the room, and he stood there calmly, neither cowering nor pushing back, simply present. Vivian asked him directly whether he still believed the Sovereign jet was unsafe, and Everett answered without raising his voice that he believed it had never been tested properly. That single sentence pulled the air out of the room, and Vivian, without hesitation, drew a red line through his name on the roster in front of everyone present, declaring aloud that a distracted single father clinging to old grievances would not be allowed anywhere near the future of her company. A few junior managers laughed under their breath, and Everett simply looked at the fresh ink on the page before turning toward the door without a word. Vivian had built her entire reputation on precision. inheriting a company from a father who had drilled into her the belief that sentiment had no place inside a boardroom, and she carried that lesson like armor into every decision she made. She had spent months preparing for this exact demonstration, coordinating with foreign delegations, rehearsing talking points about innovation and legacy, and she had no intention of allowing a single unfamiliar name to threaten months of careful planning. Dashiell understood this about her better than almost anyone, and he used it skillfully, framing Everett not as a man with a legitimate history, but as an unpredictable variable in an otherwise flawless equation. Harlan, meanwhile, cared for none of the technical nuance, viewing the entire exchange purely through the lens of investor perception, unwilling to risk even a flicker of doubt crossing the faces of men who controlled billions in capital. Everett stood through all of it with the stillness of someone who had absorbed far worse than public embarrassment, his eyes steady, his hands loosely at his sides, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of a visible reaction. When Vivian delivered her final dismissal, several assistants exchanged glances, sensing that something about the moment felt crueler than necessary, yet nobody dared say so aloud in a room where her word functioned as law. Before he reached it, veteran Captain Sawyer Beckett rose from his chair and said that if Everett Shaw was not permitted to fly, then neither was he, and the room went utterly silent. Sawyer was the most recognizable pilot at Kingsley, the face used in half the company's promotional material, a man known for discipline rather than dramatics, which made his declaration land like a thrown wrench in machinery. Vivian told him to sit down, reminding him that today's flight carried the weight of contracts, shareholders, and the entire reputation of the Kingsley family name. Sawyer instead unclipped his captain's badge and set it deliberately on the table between them. He told her that Everett had once stopped him from making a catastrophic mistake nearly a decade earlier, when a previous executive pressured him to fly despite warning systems that were not behaving correctly. Everett had been the only person willing to halt that flight, at the cost of his own promotion, and without that decision, Sawyer might have carried a tragedy for the rest of his life. Vivian's composure cracked slightly, because this story did not match the version Dashiell had fed her for years, and Dashiell quickly interrupted, insisting Sawyer was being sentimental, while Everett had already been formally flagged as a liability by the board. Before anyone could settle the argument, junior pilot Monroe Vance stood as well, removed her own flight badge, and placed it beside Sawyer's, telling the room that Everett had taught her to refuse a dangerous order, no matter how expensive the suit of the person giving it. Sawyer's story unsettled the room precisely because he was not a man given to exaggeration, and the specific detail he offered, describing the exact model of warning light that had blinked erratically that day years earlier, carried the kind of texture that only first-hand memory could produce. Vivian found herself listening more closely than she wanted to admit, aware that dismissing him outright would look worse in front of the assembled staff than simply letting him finish. Dashiell, sensing the room tilting away from his narrative, attempted to redirect attention toward the ticking clock and the waiting investors, but his interruption only made him appear more anxious rather than more authoritative. Monroe's decision to stand moments later carried its own weight, since she represented the newest generation of Kingsley pilots, trained under updated protocols and generally seen as loyal company assets rather than sentimental veterans. Her willingness to risk her still young career for a man some considered finished sent a message that Everett's influence was not rooted in nostalgia, but in something structural, something the newer pilots had been taught to value above convenience. Vivian watched the two badges sitting side by side on the table, one from decades of service and one from barely 2 years, and understood instinctively that this was no longer a simple personnel dispute she could quietly smooth over. The atmosphere in the room shifted from contempt to unease within minutes, because Vivienne had assumed this reaction belonged only to a few pilots personally close to Everett. Yet the list of resignations kept growing at a pace nobody had anticipated. Members of the jet division walked out first, followed by pilots from the test wing, then instructors from the training division, each one leaving without shouting or slamming doors, simply placing their credentials on the table in an orderly, almost ceremonial line. That silence unsettled Vivienne far more than screaming would have, because it revealed discipline rather than chaos, conviction rather than impulse. Dashiell grew furious and threatened to terminate contracts, freeze wages, and blacklist every pilot from the aviation industry entirely. But Sawyer answered calmly that a pilot could survive losing a job, though he could never survive losing his principles and still call himself a pilot. Everett remained near the doorway, his expression heavy, urging the others quietly not to sacrifice their careers on his behalf. But Monroe told him plainly that this walkout had nothing to do with pity for him, and everything to do with a company pretending it had never heard a safety warning. Word spread through the airfield within minutes, phones lighting up with the same message passed hand to hand, informing everyone that the entire pilot corps was abandoning the flight because of Everett Shaw. Investors waiting near the tarmac noticed the sudden absence of uniformed staff, and Vivienne understood with sickening clarity that without a flight crew, the demonstration would collapse in full view of the financial world before noon even arrived. Outside the operations building, the tarmac itself seemed to hold its breath, ground crews pausing mid-task as word passed from one radio channel to another that something unusual was unfolding inside. A junior communications officer nervously approached Vivienne to report that two of the visiting delegates had already noticed the unusual stillness among the flight staff and were beginning to ask pointed questions. Nobody on her team felt equipped to answer honestly. Vivienne pressed her fingers briefly against her temple, aware that every additional minute of silence from her side was being interpreted by outsiders as instability rather than composure. Dashiell tried once more to frame the walkout as an isolated labor dispute unrelated to the aircraft itself, suggesting they simply describe it to investors as routine union negotiations rather than anything involving safety concerns. Sawyer overheard the suggestion and told him flatly that lying to the pilots was one matter, but lying to the people about to fund an entire fleet of these aircraft was an entirely different scale of dishonesty. Vivienne said nothing in response, her gaze fixed on the growing line of empty chairs where certified pilots had been sitting only 20 minutes earlier. Dashiell leaned toward Vivienne and murmured that she now faced a single choice: either fire Everett Shaw immediately to reassert control, or risk losing the company entirely before lunchtime. And for a moment, Vivienne said nothing at all. She ordered the internal meeting room sealed and demanded to understand exactly why a man she had been told was volatile and unstable commanded this kind of loyalty from an entire flight division. Dashiell produced Everett's old disciplinary file, filled with entries describing refused flights, defiance of direct orders, and delays that had allegedly cost the company millions of dollars. On paper, Everett resembled a reckless obstacle rather than a principled professional. Yet when Vivienne's executive assistant, Blythe Warren, dug deeper into the archived records, she discovered several evaluation reports missing their original signatures entirely, along with revision timestamps dated well after Everett had already left active flight duty. Vivienne began to feel the first genuine crack in her certainty, and she asked Everett directly why he had never fought harder to defend his own name at the time. Everett answered that he had tried, but the executives running the company then needed a convenient scapegoat to protect the Sovereign launch schedule. And once his wife fell seriously ill and later passed away, he no longer had the strength left to battle an entire corporation while raising a child alone. He mentioned, briefly and without self-pity, that he had faced a choice between pursuing a lengthy legal fight or staying home to care for his daughter during the hardest stretch of both their lives. And he chose his daughter, letting his professional reputation be buried in the process. For the first time that morning, Vivian fell quiet in a way that felt genuine rather than tactical, realizing the phrase she had used earlier, calling him a distracted single father, might be the exact wound someone had inflicted on him years before. Vivian asked Blythe to pull every performance record connected to Everett's final year of active flight duty, hoping to find some clear justification for the harsh language used in his file. Yet what emerged instead was a pattern of inconsistencies that grew more troubling with each new page. Several evaluation forms bore two different handwriting styles despite claiming to be authored by a single supervisor, and two separate incident reports referenced meetings that, according to building access logs, had never actually taken place on the dates listed. Blythe, normally reserved and unwilling to offer personal opinions on executive matters, quietly remarked that the paperwork looked less like a disciplinary record and more like a story someone had constructed after the fact to fit a predetermined conclusion. Vivian studied Everett as he answered her questions, noting the complete absence of bitterness in his voice, despite every reason he might have had to sound resentful. He spoke about his wife's illness plainly, without theatrics, mentioning only that the timing had made it impossible to fight both a corporate machine and a hospital schedule at once, and that he had never regretted choosing his daughter over his own vindication. That admission, delivered without any apparent attempt to earn sympathy, affected Vivian more than any argument Sawyer or Monroe had made earlier that morning. Blythe interrupted the silence to announce she had located a locked digital file labeled the original Rudder Incident Report authored by Everett Shaw himself, buried under layers of archived documentation that nobody had accessed in years. When the file finally opened, it revealed that Everett had never objected to the Sovereign jet out of emotion or stubbornness, but because he had identified a real flaw in the secondary steering response system, one that surfaced only under a rare combination of rapid pressure change at moderate altitude paired with an automatic mode transition. The flaw would not likely cause a catastrophic failure under normal circumstances, yet it carried serious risk during a demonstration flight loaded with tight aerial maneuvers meant to impress onlookers. Everett had recommended delaying testing until engineers corrected the response lag, but Dashiell, who had served as program director at the time, feared losing the contract timeline and quietly altered the official report to state that the pilot had refused the flight for personal reasons instead. Vivian asked why this flaw had never resurfaced in any later safety documentation, and Everett explained that subsequent test scenarios had been deliberately rewritten to avoid recreating the exact conditions that had exposed the problem in the first place. In other words, the jet had never truly proven itself safe. It had simply never been pushed hard enough again to reveal what remained broken underneath its polished surface. Monroe supported this claim, with recent training telemetry showing the same delayed signal still present, merely disguised by updated cockpit display software that smoothed the warning into something far less alarming than reality. Everett walked Vivian through the technical language slowly, careful not to overwhelm her with jargon she had little patience for, translating the failure into terms any careful executive could understand. He explained that the secondary steering response existed as a safeguard meant to correct minor deviations automatically before a pilot needed to intervene manually, and that under the specific rare conditions he had identified, the safeguard itself became the danger rather than the solution. Dashiell, cornered by the clarity of the explanation, attempted to argue that even if such a flaw had existed years earlier, engineering teams had since replaced entire hardware components, rendering the original concern obsolete. Monroe countered that argument directly, stating that she had flown under updated hardware just weeks earlier and had personally logged a delayed correction nearly identical to what Everett described, though she had not recognized its significance at the time because nobody had told her what she was actually looking for. Vivian asked whether any official channel existed for pilots to report exactly this kind of ambiguous discomfort without risking their careers, and the silence that followed her question answered it more clearly than any spoken response could have. She began to understand, with mounting discomfort, that the very culture she had helped maintain as chief executive had effectively taught her most talented pilots that raising concerns was more dangerous than staying quiet. Harlan Prescott chose that exact moment to burst into the room, announcing that the international investors had already boarded their viewing lounge and expected takeoff within 30 minutes, regardless of whatever internal drama was unfolding behind closed doors. Harlan cared little for technical reports and everything for stock valuation, warning Vivian that a canceled flight would send shares plummeting and could cost the Kingsley family its controlling stake in the very company bearing their name. Dashiell seized the pressure of the moment to push Vivian toward using a group of contracted outside pilots who were reportedly standing by, unaware of Everett's history, uninvolved in the walkout, and willing to fly for a premium fee without asking uncomfortable questions. Everett objected immediately, explaining that outside contractors would lack sufficient flight hours specifically on the Sovereign jet, particularly under the demanding maneuvers planned for today's demonstration sequence. Dashiell mocked him openly, saying he was no longer chief pilot of anything, merely a single father working night maintenance shifts inside a hangar most executives never bothered to enter. The remark landed with a cruelty sharp enough that several nearby employees lowered their eyes in second-hand embarrassment, unwilling to witness such a public humiliation delivered so casually. Vivian still had not fully committed to trusting Everett, yet she no longer trusted Dashiell either, so she demanded that Everett prove the flaw existed using verifiable data within the next 15 minutes, agreeing that if he succeeded, every pilot present would be allowed to witness the results directly and without filtering. Harlan's arrival injected a new urgency into the room, since his authority as board chairman carried weight even Vivian could not easily dismiss, particularly with international guests already growing restless in the viewing lounge above the tarmac. He reminded everyone present that Kingsley Aeronautics had spent nearly 2 years courting this specific group of investors, and that a canceled or delayed demonstration might not simply cost money, but could permanently damage relationships built over countless dinners and negotiations across 3 continents. Dashiell used Harlan's presence as leverage, suggesting that the fastest resolution involved quietly moving forward with the backup pilots already on standby, while promising a full internal review only after the contracts were safely signed. Everett listened to this proposal with visible restraint, aware that raising his voice now would only reinforce the narrative Dashiell had spent years constructing about his temperament. Instead, he calmly proposed the 15-minute test, framing it not as a personal vendetta but as a simple, verifiable question that either confirmed or eliminated the risk entirely before anyone committed to a decision that could not be undone once the jet left the ground. Vivian, caught between Harlan's financial urgency and her own growing unease, agreed to the compromise, buying herself a narrow window in which the truth, whatever it turned out to be, could finally speak for itself. Everett agreed and pulled up the flight simulation system, entering a precise sequence of matching the exact conditions described in his original buried report, and the room watched as a red warning indicator flared across the display after exactly 47 seconds of simulated flight. The simulation recreated the precise scenario Everett had warned about years earlier, and while the jet did not crash and no dramatic emergency unfolded on screen, the secondary steering system responded nearly a full second slower than it should have under proper specifications. To an untrained observer, that single second seemed negligible, but Sawyer explained patiently to Vivian that at high demonstration speeds, a single second of delay could be the difference between a flawless performance and an uncontrollable failure witnessed by every investor in the viewing lounge. Monroe added that the cockpit display software had been quietly smoothing this exact warning to appear less severe than the underlying data actually indicated. Vivian turned toward Dashiell, who insisted the simulation had somehow been manipulated by Everett himself, yet Blythe stepped forward with additional evidence showing the simulation data pulled directly from internal servers, carrying Dashiell's own technical signature attached to the most recent software update. The room's collective gaze shifted toward Dashiell with a weight that no amount of bluster could deflect, and even Harlan's confident posture seemed to falter slightly at the sight of hard evidence rather than opinion. Everett showed no satisfaction in being proven right, saying quietly that he had spent 4 years hoping he had been wrong the entire time, a statement that struck the room harder than any triumphant declaration ever could, because he clearly wanted safety more than vindication. As the red warning indicator lingered on the display, nobody in the room spoke for several seconds, the silence itself functioning as a kind of confession that words could not have matched. Harlan, uncharacteristically quiet, leaned forward to study the numbers scrolling beside the simulation, his expression shifting from irritation to something closer to genuine concern for the first time that morning. Vivian asked Everett directly whether he had ever considered simply leaking this information publicly during the years he spent sidelined, and Everett answered that doing so would have destroyed the company's ability to fix the problem quietly, and would have cost hundreds of colleagues their jobs in the resulting fallout. His restraint, offered without any hint of self-congratulation, struck several people in the room as more damning of the company's past leadership than any accusation could have been. Dashiell attempted one final deflection, claiming the delay shown on screen fell within acceptable engineering tolerances, but Sawyer reminded him coldly that tolerances existed precisely to prevent the kind of overconfidence that had nearly cost him his life a decade earlier. Blythe's evidence linking the simulation data directly to Dashiell's own server credentials arrived at almost the same moment, closing off his last remaining avenue of denial in front of the very board members he had once controlled so easily. Sensing Vivian wavering, Dashiell shifted tactics entirely, declaring that even if Everett's technical claims were accurate, procedural rules still barred him from entering the cockpit, since his internal flight certification had been permanently revoked years earlier for what company records labeled serious insubordination. According to standard Kingsley policy, a pilot with a revoked certification could not step into the Sovereign jet under any circumstance, not even in a supervisory capacity, and Dashiell clearly believed this technicality sealed every possible path forward. Vivian found herself trapped between two unacceptable outcomes, since allowing Everett to fly against written policy could hand the board ammunition to remove her from leadership, while refusing him entirely guaranteed no pilot would agree to fly at all. Dashiell, confident he had closed both exits, proposed proceeding with the outside contractors regardless, and having them sign liability waivers to protect the company from any resulting fallout. Harlan added, with open condescension, that Everett had already won what amounted to an emotional performance, but the company could not kneel before a single father living in a rented house just to soothe his wounded pride. Several board members nodded along, viewing Everett as little more than a minor obstacle standing between them and a lucrative contract signature. Everett listened to all of it without flinching, then placed his worn flight jacket on the table and said he did not need to fly today to prove his own worth. But if they placed an underqualified crew into the Sovereign jet, every certified pilot present had every legal right to refuse that flight under both federal safety statutes and their existing labor agreements. Harlan's remark about Everett living in a rented house drew a sharp intake of breath from several younger employees standing near the back wall, aware that the remark had crossed a line separating professional criticism from personal cruelty. Vivian noticed the reaction and, for the first time all morning, felt genuinely uncomfortable being associated with the tone Harlan had chosen to use. Everett's response, calm and measured, only sharpened the contrast between his own conduct and the condescension directed at him, since he made no attempt to defend his housing situation or his finances, treating the insult as irrelevant noise rather than a wound worth acknowledging. He instead redirected the conversation back toward the only subject that mattered, reminding everyone that federal aviation regulations existed independently of any internal grudge Kingsley executives held against him personally. Dashiell scoffed, insisting that regulations could be interpreted flexibly when contracts of this size were on the line, a statement that would later prove to be the single most damaging thing he said all day. Sawyer, overhearing this exact remark, exchanged a brief glance with Monroe before both of them moved decisively toward the doorway where the rest of the flight crew had quietly gathered. Sawyer stepped beside Everett without hesitation. Monroe moved to stand beside Sawyer, and one by one every remaining pilot filed back into the room, forming a quiet, unbroken line facing the executives across the table. Sawyer spoke for the group, stating plainly that they were not walking away because of personal loyalty to Everett alone, but because the company itself had lied about a documented safety concern and continued lying to protect its own timeline. A folder was placed in front of Vivian containing a formal collective grounding request signed by every pilot certified to fly the Sovereign jet, a document clearly prepared well before today's confrontation ever began. The pilots requested nothing extravagant, no raise, no bonus, no promotion for anyone involved, only 3 specific conditions: restoration of Everett's professional record, an independent audit of the entire Sovereign program, and the permanent removal of Dashiell Crane from any future safety decisions. Vivian read every line carefully, recognizing this was not an impulsive outburst but a carefully organized, entirely legal action that had clearly been waiting years for the right moment and the right person willing to force the truth into daylight. Dashiell accused the pilots of betraying the Kingsley name itself, but Monroe answered that the company's true reputation had never lived on the fuselage of any aircraft, but rather in the willingness to refuse takeoff whenever something was known to be wrong. Through the glass wall, the Sovereign jet sat motionless on the runway, while investors began quietly exiting the viewing cabin, and outside the airfield gates, leaked details were already spreading among waiting journalists. Vivian noticed the careful legal language woven throughout the grounding request, the kind of precise wording that suggested consultation with an attorney familiar with aviation labor law rather than a hastily assembled protest written in anger. She asked Sawyer directly how long this document had existed in draft form, and he admitted, without apology, that portions of it had been prepared nearly a year earlier, waiting only for a moment when the company could no longer dismiss their concerns as isolated complaints from disgruntled individuals. That admission unsettled Vivian more than the walkout itself, because it meant the discontent she was witnessing had been simmering beneath the surface of her company for far longer than she had ever suspected, hidden by employees too afraid of retaliation to raise it through normal channels. Dashiell's accusation of betrayal rang hollow against that backdrop, and even Harlan seemed to recognize it, his earlier bravado softening slightly as he processed the scale of what had actually been building inside his own company. Outside, the sound of engines idling on standby aircraft mixed uneasily with distant voices from the investor lounge, where uniformed staff were now struggling to explain the unexplained delay using increasingly thin excuses. Vivian felt the full weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders, understanding that whatever she decided next would define not just this single launch, but the entire culture of the company her family had spent generations building. Harlan demanded that Vivian choose a side immediately, insisting that further hesitation would finish what the walkout had already started, yet Vivian remained still for several long seconds before finally reaching for her pen. Rather than signing the termination order Dashiell expected, she signed an immediate suspension notice for Dashiell Crane himself, effective before the ink had even fully dried on the page. The room fell into stunned silence, and Dashiell snapped that without him personally managing every detail, the entire launch event would collapse within the hour. Vivian answered evenly that a launch event could always be rescheduled, but a lie about safety, once discovered, could permanently destroy everything the Kingsley name had ever represented. This decision marked a genuine turning point for her character, not a moment of weakness, but a moment of clarity long overdue. She turned toward Everett and acknowledged openly, in front of the entire room, that she had wronged him earlier using information she now understood to be deliberately false. She did not ask Kim to rescue the company's public image, but instead asked him to help protect the technical truth in front of the board and the remaining investors still present on the property. Everett did not answer immediately, telling her that what he wanted was not a private apology whispered between two people, but a full public correction of every falsified record, restoring not only his name but the names of every pilot who had once been pressured into silence alongside him. The suspension order sent a visible ripple through the remaining executives in the room, several of whom had aligned themselves closely with Dashiell over the preceding years and now scrambled quietly to distance themselves from his falling reputation. Harlan attempted a brief, half-hearted defense of Dashiell's competence, citing his years of technical experience. But even he seemed to sense that continuing to champion a man caught manipulating safety data would only damage his own standing further. Vivian's public acknowledgement toward Everett carried none of the practiced polish typically found in corporate apologies, and its plainness seemed to register with everyone present as genuine rather than performative. She admitted that she had allowed a convenient story to replace actual verification, a mistake she recognized as embarrassingly common among executives who preferred tidy narratives over uncomfortable truths. Everett's insistence on a full public correction rather than a private settlement surprised several board members, who had expected him to negotiate quietly for compensation or reinstatement instead. His explanation that the other pilots deserved the same restored dignity he was being offered reinforced once again that his motivations had never centered on personal gain, a detail that shifted the sympathy of nearly everyone remaining in the room decisively in his favor. Vivian agreed without hesitation in front of the assembled board, yet a new complication surfaced almost immediately, since the Sovereign jet still needed to be moved off the active runway to prevent further disruption to flight schedules and to keep circling media crews from capturing unnecessary footage. Only one person on the entire property possessed enough intimate understanding of the aircraft systems to guide it safely into the restricted technical hangar under careful limited conditions. That person, inevitably, remained Everett Shaw, the very man who had been publicly forbidden from the cockpit only hours earlier. Vivian looked at him directly and said that she had refused to let him fly that morning, and now she was formally asking whether he would be willing to bring the aircraft safely home instead. Everett considered the request for a long moment, weighing the day's events, the humiliation, the vindication, and the responsibility still resting on his shoulders, regardless of how anyone had treated him. He finally agreed, but only under strict conditions clearly stated in front of every witness present in the room. He would not perform any demonstration maneuvers, would not carry any investors aboard, and would not turn this moment into some theatrical rescue of the company's public image, treating it strictly as a necessary technical operation rather than a spectacle. The safety committee convened an emergency review within minutes, examining Everett's original report alongside the fresh simulation data before granting the limited technical authorization Vivienne requested, a process that took barely a fraction of the time such reviews normally required, driven by the undeniable clarity of the evidence in front of them. Word of the temporary reinstatement spread through the airfield almost as quickly as news of the walkout had earlier, and the mood among ground crews shifted from confusion to quiet anticipation, aware that something rare was about to happen in full view of everyone present. Several investors who had begun drifting toward their vehicles paused when they noticed the sudden reorganization of ground personnel around the runway, sensing that whatever unfolded next might matter more than the demonstration they had originally traveled to witness. Vivienne stood near the control tower window, arms crossed, watching Everett complete his pre-flight checks with the same unhurried thoroughness he had clearly always brought to his work, regardless of how the company had treated him in the years since. Dashiell, confined temporarily to a side office pending formal review, watched the same scene through a small window, his expression unreadable to the staff assigned to monitor him. Harlan, for perhaps the first time all day, said nothing at all, simply observing the runway with the quiet attentiveness of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the company bearing his family's closest business alliance. Sawyer would occupy the secondary seat beside him, Monroe would monitor telemetry from ground control, and Vivienne signed formal, temporary authorization restoring Everett's technical flight privileges under direct board and safety committee supervision, a fully legal and transparent process, rather than any rule bent purely for dramatic effect. When Everett walked out onto the tarmac, the same employees who had laughed at him hours earlier stood in complete silence, watching a man once publicly mocked walk calmly back toward the exact place he had always belonged. There was no triumphant music playing over speakers, no dramatic display of vindication, only a quiet man in a worn jacket returning to work he had been unfairly denied for years. Once airborne, the short technical flight proved genuinely tense, since the secondary steering system exhibited the exact delay predicted by the earlier simulation almost immediately after a mode transition occurred. Everett responded calmly using the manual override procedure he had personally recommended 4 years earlier, a procedure nobody had bothered implementing until this very moment. There was no emergency, no reckless heroics, only precise skill combined with discipline and a truth finally acknowledged rather than buried. The jet touched down smoothly in front of the restricted technical hangar, where every remaining pilot stood waiting in complete silence, watching the aircraft settle safely onto the tarmac exactly as it should have all along. When Everett finally stepped down from the cockpit, nobody applauded immediately, since applause felt entirely wrong for a moment built on quiet vindication rather than spectacle. Sawyer simply raised his hand in a formal pilot salute, and one by one, every remaining member of the flight crew mirrored the gesture in complete, respectful silence. That afternoon, Vivienne held a brief, unscheduled press briefing rather than hiding behind prepared statements crafted by her communications team. She stated plainly that Kingsley Aeronautics would delay the Sovereign launch indefinitely pending an independent safety audit, that Dashiell Crane had been formally suspended pending further review, and that Everett Shaw's professional record, along with the records of every pilot who had once been silenced, would be fully and publicly restored. Harlan attempted privately to talk her out of this announcement, warning it would terrify investors, yet the reaction proved entirely opposite to his prediction. A major investment fund publicly stated they trusted a company willing to halt its own flagship launch over safety concerns far more than one, willing to hide flaws simply to protect a stock price, and the very decision Harlan feared would sink the company instead restored genuine confidence in its leadership. News of the halted launch and the subsequent restoration of Everett's record traveled quickly beyond the airfield itself, reaching aviation trade publications within hours and prompting several competing firms to publicly praise Kingsley's transparency rather than criticize its delay. Analysts who had initially predicted a disastrous drop in share value found themselves revising their outlook by the following morning, noting that markets increasingly rewarded companies willing to prioritize safety over short-term optics. Sawyer and Monroe both returned to active flight duty within the week, their earlier badges quietly returned to them without any lingering penalty, while the Independent Audit Board began combing through years of previously buried documentation with full executive cooperation. Harlan, though visibly humbled, remained on the board, having learned a lesson about the difference between protecting a family legacy and protecting a family's comfort with convenient silence. Blythe received formal recognition for her diligence, and her quiet insistence on following the evidence wherever it led became something of a model referenced in the company's revised internal reporting procedures. Dashiell's suspension eventually became permanent once the independent audit confirmed the extent of his manipulation, closing a chapter that had cost the company far more in hidden risk than it had ever saved in accelerated timelines. Everett declined the vice president position. Vivian later offered him overseeing all future test flights, choosing instead a role as an independent safety consultant with a flexible schedule that allowed him to preserve the steady, quiet life he had built raising his daughter alone. His daughter appeared only briefly in the story that evening, a simple text message lighting up his phone screen asking whether he would be home in time for dinner, and Everett smiled before typing back that he was already on his way. In the final quiet scene, Vivian stood alone inside the hangar watching pilots return to their normal duties, none of them motivated by bonuses or renewed contracts, but by the simple fact that Everett had finally been given back the truth that was always rightfully his. As Everett crossed the parking area toward his car, several of the same managers who had mocked him that morning instinctively stepped aside without a word, a small but unmistakable acknowledgement of everything that had shifted since sunrise. That morning, Vivian Kingsley had believed she held the power to ground a single father and erase him from relevance with a single stroke of red ink. By evening, she understood something far more permanent, that the entire future of Kingsley Aeronautics still depended on people exactly like Everett Shaw, quiet professionals who had once refused to stay silent when silence would have been so much easier.
Alright, I'm gonna switch to pillar stance then. I don't think I could ever play this. My patience wouldn't let me. Really? It feels really good. In this game, when you get the perfect dodge and it goes whoosh, it gives you the whoosh sound. It feels good. And it gives you like a controller vibration. It literally releases dopamine in your brain every time that happens. I'm not kidding. It feels like a drug. You're like, oh, your heart like skips a beat. I love it. Okay. Anyways. Alright. Pillar stance.